In the winter of 1880, when the temperature on the Nebraska prairie dropped to 40 degrees below zero, houses became wooden coffins. The wealthiest man in the county, with his two-story construction and his glass windows shipped from the east, watched his family shiver beneath every blanket they owned. Cattle died standing upright, frozen in vertical position like statues of meat. Trees exploded in the night with sounds like rifle shots as the ice inside their trunks expanded and split the wood from within. But on a hill north of the settlement, where the land looked deader than anywhere else, there was a wooden door half buried in the hillside, and behind that door a 16-year-old girl slept wrapped in a single thin blanket with her cheeks flushed pink and her fingers warm. Her name was Bridget Callahan, and everyone in the town had prophesied her death. But on that night it was not Bridget who needed saving. It was the prophets themselves who came knocking at her door. 6 months earlier, in June of 1880, Bridget Callahan arrived in Broken Creek, Nebraska on foot. She had walked from Omaha, not because she lacked the fare for a stagecoach, but because she could not bear the thought of sitting beside strangers on a bench for 3 days while her body broadcast the reason for her exile. She carried a canvas rucksack on her shoulders, $32 sewn into the hem of her skirt, and the memory of her father's face as he stood behind his new wife and said nothing, while the door closed on his only daughter. She was 16 years old. Her hair was the color of forge fire. She was approximately 6 weeks pregnant, and the slight thickening at her waist was invisible to everyone except her. There was no husband. There would be no forgiveness. The father of the child was a subject Bridget did not discuss then and would never discuss for the rest of her life. And the silence she wrapped around that question was not shame but armor. The kind you build when the wound beneath it is too specific and too deep for other people's curiosity to touch. Her mother had died giving birth to her, the first of many debts Bridget would owe to women who had given everything. After her mother's death, she was raised by her maternal grandmother, a woman everyone called Grandma Lou, who lived in a small earth-walled house in the New Mexico territory, where the land was red and dry and unforgiving, and the people who survived it did so by learning its language rather than shouting over it. Grandma Lou had spent her earliest years living in a cave dug into a mountainside during the years when the frontier was contested and poor families needed invisibility more than beauty. She had learned that the earth could be a mother when humans chose not to be, and she had passed that knowledge to Bridget, the way water passes through stone, slowly, persistently reshaping everything it touches. Grandma Lou died when Bridget was 12. Her father remarried a woman with a voice like a closing door and opinions about propriety that left no room for a stepdaughter who asked too many questions and read too many books. When the pregnancy became impossible to hide, the stepmother pointed at the front door, and her father stood behind his wife with his hands at his sides and his mouth closed. And that silence, the cowardice of a man who loved his daughter but not enough to fight for her, was the blade that cut deepest. Not the cruelty of the stepmother, the quiet of the father. Bridget tore up her stepmother's farewell letter on the second night of walking and used it as kindling. The settlement of Broken Creek was not a generous place for outsiders, and it was merciless toward girls in disgrace. When Bridget walked into the only general store in town and asked about land available for claim under the Homestead Act, 160 acres for any citizen willing to work them, the silence that fell was heavy enough to bruise. The men studied their boots. The women adjusted their shawls and turned their heads. 3 people spoke, and in their speaking, they established the architecture of opposition that Bridget would spend the next 6 months dismantling, with nothing but a shovel and the memory of her grandmother's voice. Harold Mercer spoke first. He was 42 years old, the most prosperous man in 50 miles, owner of a cattle ranch and a white-painted wooden house with a real porch and glass windows and 3 fireplaces that consumed wood, the way ambition consumes time. He had a waxed mustache and the habit of standing with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders, as though posing for a portrait, and his voice aimed for paternal, but landed closer to judicial. Young lady, this is no territory for a woman alone, and certainly not for one in your condition. The Christian thing would be for you to return to your family. What Harold did not say, what he could not say because he had buried it so deep that even Martha did not hear him speak of it, was that he had seen this before. The winter of 1874, 3 miles from his ranch, a young couple named Muller and their 2 children. He had found them in January when the smell should have alerted him, but the cold was so severe that nothing smelled like anything. The mother was wrapped around both children, her own clothes removed and layered over their small bodies in a final act of thermal sacrifice that had not been enough. All 4 were frozen solid. Harold had dug 4 graves in ground that fought the shovel like iron, and he had not cried, and he had started building a bigger house the following spring. When he looked at Bridget Callahan, 16 pregnant alone, he did not see stubbornness. He saw the Muller woman, and he could not watch it happen again. But instead of saying this, instead of admitting the fear that drove him, he spoke from above because speaking from above was the only dialect his pride permitted. Gustav Lindgren spoke second. 50 years old hands calloused from 3 decades of carpentry, a man who had rebuilt his entire life after bankruptcy in Minnesota, had taken everything: his shop, his house, his credit, his name. He had come to Nebraska with nothing but the skill in his fingers and the stubborn conviction that a man who could build a straight wall could build a straight life, and he had done it plank by plank, joint by joint, until he was the most respected craftsman in the territory. His laugh was short and dry. Work the land, girl. The wind out here pulls nails from walls. The first winter will carry you off before the first snowfall. What Gustav did not recognize and would not recognize until a December night, when recognition would cost him everything he believed about himself, was the irony of his contempt. He had arrived in Nebraska as a broke outsider, whom the established families had mocked and dismissed, and he had forgotten. He had climbed from ridicule to respectability and then turned around and stationed himself at the top of the same ladder to sneer at the next person trying to climb it. His disdain for Bridget was not cruelty, it was amnesia. And amnesia, unlike cruelty, cannot be forgiven until it is first remembered. Agnes Whitfield spoke third. She was the preacher's wife and the self-appointed guardian of community morals, and she wore a black dress that seemed to absorb light and gray eyes that judged before they focused. Her steps were starched. Her voice was sweetened with something that was not sugar. There is an orphanage in Lincoln. You can give the child to decent people and start fresh with a clean name. What no one in the store knew, what Agnes herself had entombed so deep inside her own mythology that she could no longer distinguish the burial site from the bedrock, was that she had lost a daughter. Grace, 3 years old, dead of fever on the open prairie with no doctor within 40 miles. Agnes had held her through the final night, singing hymns into the small hot ear, feeling the tiny body cool degree by degree, until the difference between the child and the air around her was nothing. After Grace, Agnes had built a fortress of rules and moral certainty, because if everyone lived correctly, if every action was governed by propriety and every decision by scripture, then chaos could be contained and children would not die. It was a theology of control masquerading as faith, and it had held her together for 7 years, the way a cast holds together a broken bone, functional, rigid, and preventing the healing it claims to provide. When Agnes looked at Bridget, she did not see sin. She saw Grace dying again in slow motion, and the only tool she had to stop it was the blunt instrument of moral authority. Bridget felt something harden in her chest. Not anger exactly, but something older inherited from Grandma Lou, who had taught her that the earth could be a mother when humans decided not to be. Thank you for your concern. She told the 3 of them, her fingers white around the straps of her rucksack. But I will stay. The 3 exchanged glances that said without words, this fool will not last until October. Bridget claimed a parcel of land that no one wanted, a section on the North Hill, where the soil was hard as stone, no tree grew within a mile, the grass was low and yellow, and there was no visible water. It was exactly what a person without capital or references could afford, land that even the desperate rejected. She slept under the stars the first night with her rucksack as a pillow. The second night as well. The third night she began to dig because she had remembered something Grandma Lou had told her years ago sitting together on the earthen step of the small house in New Mexico territory, peeling beans in the late afternoon shade. Grandma Lou had lived her first years in a cave carved into a hillside when the frontier was violent, and poor people needed invisibility more than beauty. The earth itself embraces you, the old woman had said with hands like tree bark. It shields you from the wind. It saves the summer warmth for winter. It does not fight you, child. It accepts you. Bridget chose a south-facing slope where the morning sun would strike directly. With a second-hand shovel purchased for $2.50, she began to excavate horizontally into the hillside, not downward like a well, but inward like a burrow. She dug in the cool mornings, rested in the midday heat, and returned to digging until darkness made it impossible to tell the difference between earth and shadow. Her hands, which had been soft despite poverty, became living tools. Blisters rose, burst, and hardened into calluses. Her nails broke to the quick. The muscles in her back burned each night with a fire that barely let her sleep. But the cave grew. Harold Mercer rode past on the third day of work and stopped to observe. Bridget was covered in dirt to her elbows, her hair tied under a rag, her shovel driving into clay with a rhythm that was almost mechanical. "What in God's name are you doing, girl?" "My home, sir." Harold removed his hat and scratched his head. "That is a cave, a hole. Civilized people build wooden houses. A wooden house costs $80 for a small one, sir. I have 15. Because a house costs 80, girl. Things cost what they cost for a reason. You will live like an animal." Bridget drove the shovel into the clay. "Animals survive the winters, Mr. Mercer. I have heard that last winter 3 families lost fingers to frostbite in wooden houses." Harold's face hardened. He did not enjoy being reminded of uncomfortable truths by a pregnant girl half his age. He spurred his horse and left without farewell. But on the ridge above her claim, he paused. He looked back at the figure digging in the hillside, small and stubborn and impossibly alone. And for a fraction of a second, something shifted behind his eyes, a crack in the plaster of certainty thin as a hair through which doubt could eventually enter. He dismissed it immediately, but the crack did not close. Gustav Lindgren came a week later with 2 of his sons bringing scrap lumber from a finished project. His voice carried the particular register that men reserve for children and fools. "Look, girl, you make me sad. Take this wood. I can teach you to build a decent shelter. It won't be a mansion, but it will have 4 walls and a roof that won't fall on your head." Bridget was squatting in front of her excavation eating hard bread with lard. "That is very generous, Mr. Lindgren, but I already have walls that no wind will blow down." Gustav looked at the hole, then at his sons, then back at Bridget. "Those are not walls. That is compacted dirt. It will crumble in the rain. You will drown in mud. This dirt has been compacted for 1,000 years before I got here. I believe it will hold a while longer." Walt, the older son, 18 years old with a face that appeared to have been born without a sense of humor, let out a snort. "Pa, she's crazy. Leave her. When winter bites, she will come crawling." They left with their lumber, but without their silence. By the end of the week, all of Broken Creek knew that the disgraced girl from Omaha was digging a cave like a savage, that she was probably touched in the head, that it was a pity about the innocent child who would bear the burden of such a foolish mother. Agnes Whitfield organized a visit of Christian charity. She arrived with 3 other women from the church circle carrying a basket containing bread, a jar of preserves, and a generous portion of condescension. "Bridget," dear Agnes began with venomous sweetness, "we have come to discuss your situation. We understand that pride can cloud judgment, especially in the young, but there are limits to what the Lord expects us to endure." Bridget received them with dirty hands and a neutral face. "You cannot live in a hole in the ground." Agnes continued, "It is undignified. It is dangerous. Think of your child." "I think of my child all the time, Mrs. Whitfield. That is why I am building a home I can maintain without depending on the charity of others." One of the women, the blacksmith's wife, whispered loudly enough to be heard. "Pride goeth before a fall." Bridget accepted the basket, thanked them with a courtesy that did not reach her eyes, and watched them leave. Their voices floated back on the prairie wind, incorrigible, headstrong, that poor child. That night, Bridget sat at the entrance of her half-finished cave and permitted one tear to roll down her cheek. Just one. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and returned to work. That same evening, Agnes sat alone in her kitchen after Josiah had gone to bed. The house was dark except for the ember glow from the stove, and in the silence, Agnes did something she did not allow herself to do in daylight. She looked at the small room at the back of the house where a child's bed still stood. White pine painted white, the paint yellowed over 7 years. No one had slept in it since Grace. Agnes kept it because dismantling it would mean admitting that Grace was not coming back. And admitting that would mean releasing the grief she had locked inside the rigid structure of her moral certainty. And releasing that grief might destroy her. She whispered into the darkness, "Am I trying to save that girl, or am I trying to save myself?" Then she pushed the question away. She was not ready for the answer. The excavation took 5 weeks of dawn-to-dark labor. Bridget carved a rectangular space approximately 10 feet wide by 15 feet deep, with enough height to stand in the center. The entrance faced south, shielded from the north wind that the neighbors described as a living knife in winter. In the 3rd week, an unexpected ally appeared. Elias Lindgren, Gustav's youngest son, 14 years old, with a curiosity larger than his prejudice, showed up with a transparent excuse about a stray cow and an opaque motive that had nothing to do with cattle. He watched Bridget work for 10 minutes before asking the question that separated him from every other person in Broken Creek. "Why are you digging sideways instead of down?" It was the first question Bridget had received that was not a judgment. She explained. And the next afternoon, Elias came back, and the afternoon after that. And he began to help carrying dirt, hauling stones, fetching water from the creek 3 miles away. Not out of pity, but out of the same instinct that makes a young person lean toward a mystery rather than away from it. He did not tell his father. Here was the secret that Grandma Lou had taught, and that the educated men of Broken Creek could not comprehend that Earth at a depth of 3 feet maintains a nearly constant temperature throughout the year. In summer, when the surface bakes at 100 degrees, the deep Earth remains cool. In winter, when the air above plummets to 30 below zero, the deep Earth stays just above freezing. It does not argue with the seasons. It absorbs them and softens them. Bridget reinforced the walls with a technique she had seen used by builders in the New Mexico territory. She mixed mud with prairie grass cut into short pieces, creating a paste that she applied in layers over the earthen walls. When it dried, it formed a hard, smooth surface that would not crumble with moisture. For the roof, she used the straightest logs she could find along the creek. There were not many, and none were perfect, but they were free. She dragged them one by one with a rope tied around her waist, Elias helping when he could. Each round trip took 4 hours. She laid the logs across the excavated space, extending them a foot beyond the walls to deflect rain. Over the logs, she placed a dense layer of thinner branches. Over the branches, she spread a waterproof tarpaulin purchased for $3. Over the tarpaulin, she piled prairie sod with its grass still attached, creating a living roof 60 centimeters thick. For the door, she used wood from shipping crates that the storekeeper sold her for $1. Not beautiful, but solid. She cut it to size, hung it on cheap hinges, and installed it to open inward so that the pressure of the winter wind would seal it tighter rather than tear it away. For windows, she had no money for glass. Instead, she cut 2 small openings, each the size of a Bible, in the south wall and covered them with greased paper stretched over wooden frames. They let in diffused light but blocked the wind. The floor she excavated 6 inches lower than the entrance level, creating a step down. This served a purpose. Cold air, which is heavier, would pool at floor level while warm air rose to body height. She covered the floor with flat stones hauled from the creek, creating a surface that would absorb heat during the day and release it at night. For heating, she spent her most precious money. She bought a dented iron barrel that the blacksmith was about to discard $2 for the barrel and 30 cents to have 2 holes welded shut. The barrel became her stove, placed at the center of the dugout with a metal pipe running through the roof to the outside. But before installing it, she dug a pit beneath the barrel 3 feet deep and 5 feet wide and filled it with large stones from the creek. This was her thermal battery. The principle was simple but powerful. When she lit a fire in the barrel, the stones beneath would absorb heat for hours. When the fire died, the stones would continue radiating warmth upward, maintaining a stable temperature through the entire night without constant feeding. She had not invented it. Grandma Lou had not invented it. It was knowledge passed down through generations of frontier people who had learned it from the land itself. She carved shelves into the walls for her few possessions. A tin plate, a spoon, a knife, a cup, candles, and matches wrapped in waxed cloth, flour, salt lard, dried beans. She sewed a thick curtain from grain sack fabric dyed with tea to hide the lettering, and hung it just inside the door to create an air buffer between outside and inside. She accumulated dried buffalo dung from the prairie, stacking it against the north exterior wall for supplemental fuel and insulation. She carved a drainage channel around the entrance, lined it with small stones, and directed it away from the door. The total cost tallied on the last page of her Bible, $17.30. She had $14.70 remaining for food: 3 potatoes, half a sack of flour, and a jar of lard. Bridget finished her dugout in the first week of September 1880. She stood before her door of recycled shipping crates, looking at the mound of earth and grass that was her roof, and felt something deeper than pride. It was sufficiency. It was independence earned with blisters and an aching back. That first night, she lay on a straw mattress she had collected and stuffed into a hand-sewn cover. And the silence inside the dugout was different from the silence of the open prairie. It was an embracing silence, dense and warm, like resting in the palm of an immense and gentle hand. No wind, no creaking of wood fighting the elements. Only the occasional sound of a field mouse in a corner and her own breathing. For the first time since her father had stood mute while the door closed on her, Bridget Callahan wept. Not from sorrow, from relief. 2 weeks later, the earth tested her. A rainstorm struck without warning in mid-September, 2 days of downpour that turned the prairie into a shallow sea of mud and running water. Bridget woke on the second morning and found water pooling on her stone floor 10 centimeters deep and rising. The drainage channel she had carved around the entrance was too shallow. The stone lining was too thin. Water was finding its way along the doorframe and seeping inside. She stood in the center of her home, watching the water creep across the stones she had hauled from the creek, and for a terrible moment, she faced a choice that would define everything that followed. She could abandon the dugout scramble outside into the rain and survive the day on open ground, safe in the short term, but possibly losing everything she had built if the water undermined the walls. Or she could stay inside and fight the water, while it was still manageable, digging a deeper channel in the rain, reinforcing the barrier, gambling her safety on the chance that the fix would hold. She chose to stay. For 6 hours, she worked in the downpour, knee-deep in mud, her pregnant belly pressing against her thighs when she bent to dig. She carved the drainage channel deeper, twice as deep as before, lined it with stones packed tight, and built an earthen lip a yard from the door to deflect surface water before it reached the entrance. Her hands were numb. Her back screamed. The baby inside her was a weight that shifted with every movement, pulling her off balance, reminding her with every stumble that she was not only risking her own life. The rain stopped near dusk. The water drained. The stones on the floor, which she had laid for thermal mass, served a purpose she had not anticipated. They wicked the moisture out of the air, and the floor dried within a day. That night, she lay on the damp stone floor, too exhausted to feel anything. And for the first time, she doubted herself. Am I killing my child? The question sat in her chest like a stone of its own, cold and heavy. Then the baby moved a flutter, Then a definite push, the first kick she had felt clearly, and it came like an answer delivered from inside her own body. The news traveled. Gustav heard about the flooding and told Walt, "You see, rain alone nearly killed her. Wait for the snow." But Elias, who had walked up the hill the day after the rain to check on Bridget, found the new channel, the reinforced barrier, the dry floor. He said nothing to his father. But he knew something the older Lindgrens did not. The girl had not merely survived. She had learned and adapted, and the speed of her adaptation was faster than anything he had seen from adults who had been building on this prairie for years. Autumn arrived in Broken Creek wearing a mask of gold, and the land played its oldest trick, pretending that warmth was permanent. The cottonwoods along the creek shivered with yellow leaves that caught the light like coins scattered by a careless hand. The air smelled of dry grass and sun-baked soil, and the sky stretched so wide and blue that a person could forget it had ever held a cloud. Meadowlarks sang from fence posts. Grasshoppers clicked across the trails. The prairie exhaled its last generous breath before the long inhale of winter, and most people in Broken Creek breathed with it lazy and unhurried, as though December were a rumor someone else had invented. Bridget Callahan did not breathe with it. She moved through October like a woman building an ark while the sky was still clear, because the sky being clear was precisely the problem. Every golden afternoon was a lie wrapped in beauty. Every warm evening a theft of time she could not afford to waste. Her body had changed since September. The swell beneath her dress was unmistakable now. Not yet the heavy, low-slung weight of the final months, but a firm, round presence that announced itself when she bent to lift a stone or twisted to pull a root from stubborn soil. She was 4.5 months along, and the child inside her was growing with the same stubborn insistence that had carried her from Omaha. She had not yet felt it kick regularly, but she spoke to it sometimes at night, lying on her straw mattress in the dark, telling it about the walls that would keep it warm, and the roof that would keep it dry, and the grandmother it would never meet who had made both possible. She gathered fuel first. Buffalo chips, the dried dung patties that littered the prairie like brown plates left by giants, burned slow and steady, producing heat without the acrid smoke of green wood. She collected them in a canvas sack slung over her shoulder, walking wider circles each day as the nearest supply diminished. By mid-October, she had accumulated a pile against the north-facing rock shelf above her dugout, stacked in rows like bricks protected from rain by the overhang. She counted them obsessively. 47 patties per week at 2 burns per day. 20 weeks of winter meant she needed at least 940. She had 612. Not enough. Not yet. She set wire snares along the rabbit runs she had mapped during her weeks of excavation, paths worn through the grass by generations of cottontails following the same invisible highways their ancestors had traveled. The first snare caught nothing for 4 days. The 5th day, she found a rabbit hanging by its hind leg, eyes wide, body still warm. She knelt beside it and pressed her thumb against the soft fur below its jaw until she felt the pulse stop. Then she carried it back to the dugout, hung it from a peg she had driven into the ceiling beam, and opened it from throat to belly with the knife that had cost her 15 cents in Omaha. Her hands trembled through the entire process. The blood was warmer than she expected, and the smell, metallic, intimate, alive, stayed under her fingernails for 2 days despite scrubbing. She ate the meat fresh that night, roasted on a flat stone laid across the barrel stove. The rest she cut into strips and hung from the ceiling where the cool, dry air of the dugout would cure them slowly. The same principle that had preserved venison in Grandma Lou's root cellar. Within a week, the strips hardened into jerky that would last months without spoiling. The skin she scraped and stretched on a frame of bent willow branches. 1 rabbit skin was nothing. 20 rabbit skins stitched together would be a blanket. She needed time and patience, and rabbits and the prairie had all 3 if you knew where to look. Down in the valley, a different kind of preparation was underway. Harold Mercer had 4 cords of split oak delivered from the timber merchant in Grand Island, $40 worth of fuel, stacked in precise rows beside his 2-story house like a wooden fortress wall. Each cord measured 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, 8 feet long, and Harold walked the perimeter of his supply each morning, the way a general inspects battlements. His sons, 17 and 15, spent their afternoons sealing window frames with oakum and tar, pressing the caulking material into every gap where daylight showed through. The house was the finest in 50 miles, and Harold intended to keep it that way. He had built it for a reason that lived in a small grave behind the barn. And every nail he had ever driven was an argument against the memory of a January night 6 years ago when arguments had not been enough. Gustav Lindgren invested in glass. $12 for 4 pennies shipped from the factory in Pittsburgh, each one wrapped in straw and delivered with the kind of care usually reserved for newborns. He installed them in the new room himself. The addition he had built that summer, with its imported brick chimney and tongue-and-groove flooring. The room that represented everything he had clawed back from the bankruptcy that had swallowed his life in Minnesota. Every joint was tight, every angle was true. Gustav ran his hands along the window frames the way a sculptor touches finished marble, feeling for imperfections that did not exist. His wife watched him from the doorway. A wool shawl pulled tight, despite the mild afternoon, the cough she had carried since August rattling in her chest, like a pebble in a tin cup. Agnes Whitfield's cast-iron stove arrived on the first Tuesday of October, hauled by wagon from Kansas City at a cost that made Josiah's eyebrows climb toward his hairline. $35. The stove was a cathedral of iron decorated with pressed floral patterns along its flanks, large enough to heat the main room and the kitchen simultaneously, with a cooking surface that could hold 6 pots. 4 men wrestled it through the front door, while Agnes directed them with the precision of a field commander, pointing to the exact spot she had measured, and remeasured the spot where the flue would align with the chimney that Josiah had built the previous spring. The chimney that pulled beautifully in calm weather. The chimney that no one had tested in a north wind. Bridget watched these preparations from her hilltop, the way a bird watches ships from a cliff with interest but without envy. She understood something that could not be purchased at any price. That preparation was not the same thing as resistance. Harold was fortifying. Gustav was reinforcing. Agnes was insulating. Each of them was building a wall against the season. Bridget was not building a wall. She was building a partnership, and the silent partner had been doing its part since before anyone in Broken Creek was born. She foraged through the creek bottoms in the thinning October light, pulling burdock roots from soil that released them with a soft sucking sound, digging wild onions with her bare fingers, collecting sunflower seeds from the heavy-headed stalks that leaned over the water like mourners at a funeral. Everything edible went into the dugout. Everything combustible went onto the pile. She moved with the efficiency of someone who understood that abundance was temporary and that the golden afternoons were numbered in single digits. On a Thursday near the end of October, Elias Lindgren appeared at the top of the hill with the transparent excuse of a lost cow and the opaque motive of a 14-year-old boy who could not stop thinking about a hole in the ground that was warmer than his father's house. He stood at the entrance, shifting his weight from boot to boot, and finally managed the question that had brought him up the hill and past his father's prohibition against associating with the crazy girl who had no business being in Nebraska. "Can I see inside?" Bridget studied him for a moment. The red ears, the nervous hands, the eyes that held curiosity rather than contempt, and stepped aside. Elias ducked through the doorway, dropped down the step, and stopped. His mouth opened. His shoulders, which had been hunched against the October wind, dropped 3 inches as the warmth wrapped around him like water around a wading child. The air inside was still heavy and warm in a way that had nothing to do with fire, because there was no fire burning. The barrel stove sat cold and dark. The warmth came from the earth itself, from the stones in the floor, from the walls that had spent an entire summer drinking sunlight, and were now exhaling it slowly into the enclosed space. It's warm in here. It's freezing outside, and it's warm in here. How the earth holds summer's heat the way a jar holds water. Slow, patient. It doesn't let go all at once. And in summer it will hold winter's cool the same way. Elias pressed his palm flat against the wall. The surface was smooth and slightly warm, like touching the flank of a sleeping animal. He had helped his father build houses since he was old enough to hold a hammer level, and he had never felt a wall that was warm without a fire behind it. Everything he knew about construction, the studs, the joists, the siding, the insulation made of newspaper and straw packed between inner and outer walls. All of it was built on the assumption that a wall's job was to keep cold out. This wall was not keeping cold out. This wall was breathing warmth from inside itself, from a reservoir so deep and so patient that it had been charging since April and would not be empty until March. My pa says this will collapse. Your pa is a fine carpenter, Elias, but dirt doesn't work like wood. Wood fights the weather. Dirt lives with it. He stayed 5 minutes longer, asking questions. She answered without condescension, touching surfaces, looking up at the ceiling, where the logs held firm under their blanket of earth and living grass. When he left, the mockery was gone from his eyes. Something else had replaced it. Not belief exactly, but the precursor to belief. The hairline crack in certainty through which belief eventually enters. He did not tell his father. 3 weeks later, on a grey afternoon in mid-November, when the first hard frost had turned the prairie white and brittle, Martha Mercer walked up the North Hill alone. She wore her heaviest shawl and her second-best boots, and her nose was red from the cold by the time she reached the dugout entrance. She had not told Harold she was coming. She had not told anyone. This was not a social call or a charity visit or an inspection. This was something Martha did not have a word for, a need to see for herself whether the thing the whole town had dismissed was the thing the whole town needed. Bridget invited her in, and Martha descended the step into the dugout and immediately felt the tension leave her body in a way that was almost embarrassing. Her jaw unclenched. Her fingers uncurled, her spine softened. The temperature difference between the outside air and the interior space was not dramatic, perhaps 20 degrees, but the quality of the warmth was entirely different from anything she had experienced in a wooden house. There were no hot spots near the stove and cold spots by the walls. There were no drafts probing for exposed skin. The air was uniformly, gently, persistently warm, the way a pond is uniformly warm once you sink below the surface layer. Lord in heaven, she breathed. It's warm. It's actually warm. Not hot, but constant. That's the difference. Martha looked around the space with eyes that were seeing, rather than judging, the smooth-plastered walls. The stone floor with its subtle sheen of absorbed heat. The iron barrel stove sitting ready but unlit, the carved shelves holding provisions in neat rows. Everything was modest. Everything was orderly. Everything worked. It feels like being held, Martha said quietly, and then colored at her own words. Bridget offered her the only seat, the rough stool she had carved from a cottonwood stump, and Martha sat, and in the silence that followed, something shifted between them. Martha was 50 years old. She had buried a child, built a life on a prairie that tried to kill her every winter, and maintained a public face of composure that cost her more energy than any blizzard. Bridget was 16 and carrying a child whose father would never be named. They had nothing in common except the thing that mattered most. They both understood what it meant to survive something that should have destroyed them. Martha's voice dropped to a register Bridget had not heard before. Low private scrape clean of social performance. Harold doesn't talk about it. He won't allow me to talk about it. But we had a son before the boys you've seen, William. He was 8 months old the first winter we spent here. We were living in a one-room cabin, then logs chinked with mud, one window covered with oilcloth. The wind found every gap. William got the lung sickness in January. There was no doctor within 40 miles. I held him for 3 nights and listened to his breathing get thinner and thinner until it wasn't there anymore. The dugout was very quiet. The earth held them both without comment. Harold dug the grave himself. The ground was frozen so hard he broke 2 shovel handles before he reached deep enough. He didn't cry. He has never cried. But the next spring he started building. A bigger house, better wood, real windows, then a bigger one after that. Then the one we have now, 2 stories, 3 fireplaces, glass shipped from back east. Martha's hands twisted in her lap. He thinks if the walls are thick enough, and the roof is strong enough, and the fire is hot enough, then this time it will be different. This time no one dies. Martha looked at Bridget with an expression that contained both a confession and a question. But you know something he doesn't, don't you? I only know what my grandmother taught me. She said the earth is already talking. Most people are just too busy hammering to hear it. Martha left a fresh loaf of bread and a look that was no longer pity. It was respect, confused, reluctant, but unmistakable. Bridget watched her walk down the hill toward the two-story house that Harold Mercer had built as a monument to a grief he could not name, and she felt something she had not expected to feel for the man who had told her to go back to Omaha. She felt compassion. Everything Harold Mercer had done, every dollar spent, every nail driven, every window installed, was the action of a father trying to build a wall between his family and the memory of a January night when a baby's breathing stopped. He was wrong about the method, but the love underneath was real, and Bridget understood love that expressed itself through labor, because she was living inside the proof of it. The cold deepened through the last weeks of November. At the general store, old Silas delivered his annual prophecy to the men gathered around the pot-bellied stove. His three remaining fingers wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, the stumps where the other fingers had been rubbing against the warm metal, as if trying to remember what wholeness felt like. Beavers are building higher dams than I've seen in 30 years on this prairie. Squirrels are storing double. Geese left 2 weeks early. This winter will bite, boys. I can feel it in the bones I still have. The men laughed because laughing was easier than preparing, and preparing was easier than admitting that preparation might not be enough. The first real test came on a night in mid-November when the temperature dropped to 12 below zero, and the wind picked up from the north, and Broken Creek discovered in the space of 8 hours exactly how much it did not know about cold. In the Mercer house, all three fireplaces burned through the night. Harold fed them with the mechanical rhythm of a man stoking a locomotive, log after log disappearing into flames that roared and crackled and sent their heat straight up the chimney flues and into the black sky, where it vanished as completely as if it had never existed. The rooms nearest the fireplaces were tolerable. The rooms away from them were not. The upstairs bedrooms, which received only the residual heat that managed to climb the staircase before dissipating, dropped below freezing before midnight. The water pitcher on the bureau in the master bedroom developed a skin of ice by 2 in the morning. Martha lay beneath 3 quilts and a buffalo robe and stared at the ceiling and thought about a dugout on a hill where the walls breathed warmth without being asked. In the Lindgren house, the beautiful new room with its imported brick chimney and Pittsburgh glass windows revealed a flaw that no amount of craftsmanship could have predicted. The chimney drew magnificently, perhaps too magnificently. The draft it created was so strong that it pulled air from the rest of the house through every doorway and every crack, creating a vacuum that sucked warmth from the older rooms and funneled it up through the flue with ruthless efficiency. The harder Gustav fired the new room stove, the colder the rest of the house became. His wife's cough worsened through the night, each spasm rattling deeper in her chest, and Gustav lay beside her in the dark, feeling something he had not felt since the day the bank in Minnesota had taken his house. The sensation of a structure he had built with his own hands turning against him. In the Whitfield house, the chimney problem that had been a nuisance in mild weather became a siege. North wind pushed down the flue and drove smoke back into the rooms in thick, eye-burning waves. Josiah stuffed rags around the damper. The smoke found other paths. Agnes opened a window to vent the haze, and the cold entered like a living thing, wrapping itself around Clara, who was curled on a pallet near the stove, with her knees pulled to her chest and her feet small bare white, exposed to air that was well below freezing. Agnes slammed the window shut. The smoke returned. There was no solution that did not create another problem, no warmth that did not come packaged with poison. In the dugout on the North Hill, Bridget built a small fire in the barrel stove at dusk, 2 fistfuls of dried buffalo chips, nothing more, and sat on her stool reading the Book of Ruth by candlelight. while the stones beneath the stove absorbed heat with the patient greed of things that had been waiting for exactly this. The temperature inside held at 59 degrees. No drafts found the candle flame. No wind penetrated the 2 meters of compacted earth that separated her from the howling darkness. Her provisions, which she had feared would run short, were stretching further than calculated. Because her body was not burning extra calories to generate warmth, she was not shivering, she was not suffering, she was simply living. And the simplicity of it was its own kind of miracle. The miracle of being adequate, of having built something that asked nothing more of the world than what the world was already giving. That night, Harold Mercer stood at his bedroom window, with binoculars pressed to his eyes, looking north toward the hill, where a thin column of smoke rose straight and steady from a pipe protruding from what appeared to be nothing more than a natural rise in the landscape. "Still there," he said to the dark room. Martha's voice came from beneath the quilts, quiet but distinct. In a way, it usually was not, as if the cold had scraped away the habitual deference and left something harder underneath. "Maybe she knows something, Harold." Harold lowered the binoculars. He did not argue. He did not agree. He stood in silence for a long time, and the fact that he did not dismiss the idea was, in 22 years of marriage, the loudest thing Martha had ever heard him not say. Days shortened, temperatures sagged. The golden veil of autumn was gone, replaced by a sky the color of old iron, and a wind that carried the particular dry cold of the high plains. A cold that did not merely chill the skin, but seemed to reach through it to the bones beneath, extracting warmth with the efficiency of a pump drawing water from a well. The prairie grass, which had been gold, turned white and brittle. The creek ran slower, its edges thickening with ice that grew inward a little more each night. On a night in late November, after the rest of the house had settled into sleep, Agnes Whitfield sat alone in her kitchen in the dark. Clara was in bed, her feet tucked beneath the quilt, and Josiah was snoring the righteous snore of a man who believed that prayer was preparation enough. Agnes could not sleep. She had not been able to sleep well since October, since the night she had lain awake and felt the particular terror of watching Clara cough a single cough. Ordinary, meaningless, and had felt the entire architecture of her self-control shudder like a house in high wind. She rose and went to the small room at the back of the house that served as storage. In the corner behind a trunk of winter linen stood the child's bed. It was small enough to hold in both arms. It was made of pine, sanded smooth, painted white. The paint had yellowed over 7 years, but the bed was otherwise pristine because no one had slept in it since the night Grace had been placed in it for the last time, burning with fever, her small hands opening and closing on nothing. Agnes knelt beside the bed and pressed her face into the thin mattress and breathed in, searching for a scent that had been gone for years. Then she stood and went to her knitting basket. She pulled out a half-finished garment, small, impossibly small. The kind of thing you knit for a baby, and worked on it for an hour in the dark, her fingers finding the stitches by memory, her mind traveling a road she did not allow herself to walk in daylight. When the garment was finished, she folded it carefully, placed it in a cloth sack with a box of matches and a packet of dried chamomile, and set the sack by the door. Before dawn, she carried it up the north hill and set it in front of the dugout entrance and walked back down without looking behind her. She could not say the words her hands had said. She was not ready. But the hands knew what the mouth would not admit, that somewhere between judgment and mercy, between the memory of a dead daughter and the fear of watching another child die, there was a woman who wanted to help and did not know how, except in secret, except in darkness, except through the anonymous language of wool and warmth. Bridget found the sack that morning. No name, no note. She examined the tiny knitted garment. The stitches were expert tight uniform, the work of hands that had been knitting for decades, and recognized the pattern. Every woman in Broken Creek knitted, but this particular cable stitch was one she had seen on Agnes Whitfield's shawl at the charity visit. She held the garment against her belly where the baby kicked, and she understood that the person who had judged her most harshly in daylight was the same person who had come to her door in darkness, with the only offering that mattered, something made by hand given without expectation, delivered in the only language that the giver's pride would permit. She did not know the full story. She did not know about grace or the white bed or the 7 years of grief compressed into rigid morality. But she knew enough. She knew that cruelty and kindness could live in the same body, could be fed by the same wound, could take turns wearing the same face. And she knew that the small garment in her hands was not a peace offering. It was a confession, wordless, unsigned, placed at her door, like a prayer left at an altar, by someone who was no longer sure the altar was listening. December came in grey and bitter, and the prairie contracted. Animals vanished into burrows and dens. Birds that had lingered too long departed in ragged formations, their cries growing thin and desperate as they climbed south. The creek froze solid in a single night, and the silence that replaced its murmur was the kind of silence that means something has died. On the morning of December 23rd, 1880, the world stopped making sound. No wind, no birds, no insects, no creak of branch or whisper of grass. The silence was so complete and so unnatural that it had weight pressing against the eardrums like a hand held over the mouth. The sky turned a color that old Silas, if he had been a painter rather than a trapper, might have called jaundiced, a yellow-gray that sat low on the horizon and seemed to pulse with something trapped inside it. The air smelled of metal. At the general store, old Silas set down his coffee cup and spoke to no one and everyone. "She's here. Close everything. Tie down what you can. Pray about the rest." By noon, the temperature had fallen 20 degrees. By 3 in the afternoon, the snow began not the fat, gentle flakes of Christmas postcards, but horizontal needles of ice driven by a wind that had gathered speed across 1,000 miles of open plain, with nothing to slow it down. By 6, the world had dissolved. There was no horizon, no sky, no ground, only a white, shrieking vortex that erased the distinction between up and down, between breathing and drowning, between being alive and being buried. This was the blizzard that history would call the hard winter of 1880, a storm that killed cattle from Montana to Texas and froze creek beds so deep that some would not thaw until May. In the Mercer house, the wind found what oakum and tar had missed. Drafts snaked through invisible gaps and extinguished candles, and bent the fireplace flames sideways. Harold and his sons worked through the first night in relay, feeding the 3 fireplaces, with a rhythm that grew more frantic as the woodpile shrank. By the second evening, Harold sat at his kitchen table with a pencil and a scrap of paper, and performed the arithmetic that would humble him more completely than any sermon Josiah Whitfield had ever delivered. At current burn rate, he had 36 hours of fuel remaining. The storm showed no sign of stopping. He would have to abandon the upper floor, seal the stairway with blankets, and concentrate everyone in the front room around the central fireplace. His beautiful house, the house he had built for William. The house that was supposed to be the answer would shrink to a single room, and even that room would grow colder by the hour. The water in the bedroom pitcher did not merely skin over with ice. It froze solid. Martha found it in the morning and held it in both hands, and wept not because of the ice itself, but because of what it meant. The cold was inside. It had breached the walls, crossed the threshold, entered the rooms where her children slept. Harold's fortress had been infiltrated, and there was nothing left to reinforce it with. In the Lindgren house, the chimney paradox reached its terminal conclusion. The new room's flue drawing with the power of a bellows had created a pressure differential that turned the rest of the house into a wind tunnel. Every door became a funnel. Every crack became a channel. The older rooms, which had been merely cold before the new room was built, were now Arctic. The addition had made the original house worse, had stolen its warmth to feed a chimney that vented it into oblivion. Gustav stood in the doorway of his masterpiece, his hand on the knob, and understood. He closed the door. He sealed the gaps with rags. He walked away from the finest room he had ever built, the room that contained 30 years of skill and pride and recovery from ruin. and he left it to freeze because keeping it alive meant killing everything else. His wife coughed blood onto the pillow at midnight. The sound of it wet, deep tearing was the sound of Gustav Lindgren's certainty dying. He had built homes his entire adult life. He had measured and cut and joined and sealed and painted and finished. And he had believed with the unshakable faith of the craftsman that a well-built structure could withstand anything. But the wind did not care about his joints. The cold did not respect his measurements. And the woman he loved was drowning in her own lungs, in a house that he had built with his own hands, and that was failing her in every way that mattered. In the Whitfield house, the smoke problem became lethal. When Josiah lit the stove, the north wind rammed smoke back down the chimney and filled the rooms with a haze so thick that breathing became a choice between cold and poison. When he let the fire die, the temperature plummeted, and Clara's feet, already damaged by the first frost exposure, began to swell and darken. The skin on her smallest toes turned the color of bruised plums. Agnes wrapped them in wool and held them between her thighs. The way she had held Grace's feet on the last night, the same gesture, the same desperate transfer of body heat from mother to child, the same prayer that this time it would be enough. Josiah knelt on the cold floor and prayed for 2 hours. He asked for spring. He asked for mercy. He asked for the wind to stop. The wind did not stop. The cold did not relent. And somewhere in the second hour, in the space between one plea and the next, Josiah Whitfield encountered a silence from heaven that was louder than any answer, the silence of a universe that operated on principles older than prayer. Principles of thermodynamics and convection and heat transfer that did not bend to the will of men who had built their chimneys wrong. 3 smaller families on the outskirts faced their own private catastrophes. Cattle froze upright in barns, legs locked, eyes open, coated in frost that made them look like marble statues of themselves. Chickens died on their nests, feathers puffed heads tucked frozen in the posture of sleep. A dog that had been left outside by accident was found the next morning at the back door, frozen solid in the act of scratching to get in. One paw raised, mouth open, the last desperate motion of its life preserved in ice like an insect in amber. The thermometer at the general store read 38 below zero on the second night, then 40, then 42, and on the North Hill behind a door, made from shipping crates below a roof of earth, and living grass that was now buried under 3 feet of snow and indistinguishable from the landscape around it. Bridget Callahan sat on her cottonwood stool with a candle burning steady and golden in air so still that the flame did not flicker once in 12 hours. She was sewing a bonnet for a baby who would arrive before the snow melted, and the needle moved through the fabric with the unhurried precision of someone who was not cold, not afraid, not fighting. The temperature inside the dugout was 55 degrees. Outside, the air killed exposed flesh in minutes, but 2 meters of earth and stone stood between Bridget and the death that prowled the prairie. The earth had spent an entire summer and autumn absorbing the sun's warmth, banking it deep below the frost line, in a reservoir that no carpenter could build, and no amount of money could buy. And now it released that warmth slowly, steadily, generously. A gift so patient it seemed like a law of physics rather than an act of grace, which perhaps it was both. The barrel stove held a small fire, 2 handfuls of buffalo chips no more, and the stones beneath it glowed with stored heat. The thermal battery worked as Grandma Lou had described, and as generations had practiced on the American frontier, absorbing energy when the fire burned and radiating it back when the fire died, maintaining a temperature so stable that Bridget had stopped checking the thermometer because the answer was always the same. The burlap curtain at the entrance sealed the airlock. The inward opening door pressed tighter against its frame with every gust. The stepped-down floor trapped cold air below the sleeping level. Every element worked in concert, not through brilliance, but through humility, through the willingness to learn from the earth instead of arguing with it. She ate a simple dinner. Bean soup with a potato, yesterday's bread, chamomile tea brewed from the packet that had been left anonymously at her door. Her provisions were holding, because her body was not wasting calories on shivering, not burning reserves to generate heat that would be stolen by drafts. She was warm-fed, sheltered, and alone with a child growing inside her, and against every prophecy the town had pronounced, she was perfectly unambiguously, stubbornly fine. On the third night, when the cold reached its killing peak, and the wind screamed across the prairie with a sound like a continent tearing itself apart, something broke inside Harold Mercer. He sat in his front room with his back against the wall, and his wife trembling under 4 quilts beside a fire that was eating the last of his wood. And the thought arrived not as a whisper, but as a hammer blow that drove him down past pride, past expertise, past 20 years of being the most prosperous man in 50 miles, down to the bedrock, where the truth lived stripped of everything he had built on top of it. The girl on the hill knows something I don't know. She has known it since June. And the thing she knows is keeping her alive tonight. While everything I own, every board, every nail, every dollar, every certainty is failing to keep my family warm. He looked at Martha. Martha looked back. And in her eyes, he saw not accusation, but recognition. The look of a woman who had arrived at the same conclusion hours ago and had been waiting for him to catch up. 3 miles away, Gustav Lindgren held his wife against his chest and felt her heartbeat thin and rapid against his ribs, and listened to the rattle in her lungs, and remembered the warmth of an earthen wall against his palm on an October afternoon, steady, sourceless, impossible by every principle he had been taught. The girl had tried to explain, and he had refused to hear it, because hearing it would have meant dismantling something far more dangerous than a house. It would have meant dismantling the belief that his hands alone could keep his family safe. Now his wife was coughing blood 3 feet from the finest chimney he had ever built, and the belief was dismantling itself without his permission. In the parsonage, Agnes Whitfield held Clara's swollen feet and rocked her gently in the smoky darkness, and felt the walls of her carefully constructed world crack from floor to ceiling. For 7 years she had kept the chaos of grief at bay with rules and righteousness, and the absolute certainty that if people lived correctly, morally, structurally, socially, then tragedy could be prevented. She had judged Bridget Callahan because judging was the only tool she had against the terror of randomness, against the possibility that children died, not because their mothers sinned, but because chimneys were built wrong, and winters were long, and the world did not care about virtue. Now Clara's toes were purple, and the smoke was in her lungs, and the rules had failed, and the righteousness was worthless, and Agnes Whitfield, for the first time in 7 years, did not know what to do next. The wind howled. The temperature dropped another degree. And somewhere in the howling, in the dropping, in the long dark hours between midnight and dawn, 3 separate households in Broken Creek arrived at the same destination without consulting each other, without coordinating, without anything in common except the shared experience of having been wrong about a girl, a hole in the ground, and the nature of shelter itself. They would go to the hill. They would go to the girl they had called foolish, the girl they had called doomed, the girl whose death they had predicted with the barely concealed satisfaction of people who mistake certainty for wisdom. They would ask to come inside. The dawn of December 26th broke over Broken Creek like a wound opening. The blizzard had paused, not ended. The clouds still hung low and pregnant with malice, but the wind had dropped to something a human body could lean into without being thrown backward. And the silence that replaced the shrieking was so abrupt it felt like going deaf. The prairie lay buried under white that erased roads, fences, property lines. The entire human claim on the landscape dissolved under a single blanket that did not care who owned what. The sun was a pale disk behind gauze, giving light without warmth, and the air at ground level was 20 below zero and still enough to kill. 3 groups emerged from 3 houses and began walking in 3 different directions that all pointed toward the same place. Harold Mercer led his family through snow that reached his thighs, breaking trail, with the wide mechanical stride of a man who had stopped thinking and was operating on something older than thought, the animal imperative to find warmth or die. Martha followed in his wake, her lips colorless, her fingers curled inside gloves that had stopped being adequate 12 hours ago. Behind her, the two boys moved in single file, their ears swollen to twice their normal size, and flushed the angry crimson that precedes frostbite's final stage when the color drains and the tissue begins to die. None of them spoke. Speaking required breath, and breath was currency they could not afford to spend. Gustav Lindgren carried his wife. She weighed perhaps 110 pounds, but in the snow and the cold and the altitude of exhaustion, she felt like the sum of every mistake he had ever made, dense, unyielding, growing heavier with each step. Her head rested against his collarbone, and her breathing was the shallow, rapid panting of a body that was losing an argument with its own lungs. Elias walked behind his father, carrying a blanket roll and watching the trail of kicked-up snow with the focus of someone who understands that if his father falls, the next decision will be his. Walt brought up the rear with his jaw clenched so tight, the muscles in his temples bulged like rope. Josiah Whitfield carried Clara against his chest, her legs dangling, her feet wrapped in strips torn from a bedsheet because her shoes would not fit over the swelling. Agnes walked beside him, with her hand on his arm, partly for balance in the deep snow, and partly because she needed to touch something living and warm and vertical. Her eyes were raw from smoke and crying, and the skin beneath them had the bruised translucence of someone who has not slept in 3 days. They converged on the north hill from 3 directions, and when they saw each other, 3 separate delegations of failure arriving at the same altar. There was a moment of recognition so pure it bordered on communion. Harold looked at Gustav, and Gustav looked at Josiah, and each man saw in the other's faces the exact expression he was wearing himself, the expression of someone who has been stripped down past competence, past certainty, past the social armor that separates a man from his most basic terror. They were fathers whose houses had failed. They were husbands whose expertise had proven worthless. They were men, and the thing that would save their families was a hole in the ground, built by a pregnant girl with a shovel and $15. They stopped 20 paces from the dugout entrance and formed a rough semicircle without planning to the geometry of surrender, arranging them as neatly as if it had been choreographed. The door was closed. The pipe chimney released a thin thread of smoke into the still air, vertical and undisturbed. The mound of earth and snow that was the roof looked like any other hillock on the prairie, unremarkable, almost invisible, the kind of thing you would ride past 1,000 times without knowing a human being lived inside it. Bridget was outside. She had come out during the lull to collect clean snow for meltwater, carrying a wooden bucket and wearing a wool coat that was too large for her, and boots that were cracked at the seams. Her belly was obvious now even through the coat, the swell of it changing her center of gravity, so that she stood with her weight shifted back one hand, instinctively resting on the lower curve. She saw them coming before they saw her. 3 dark clusters of movement against the white expanse, and she set the bucket down slowly and waited. Harold found words first. Each one arrived as if dragged up from a depth where language goes to die. My children are freezing. We burned the last of our wood before dawn. The walls of my house have ice on the inside of the glass. His voice cracked on the final word, not from cold, but from the specific agony of a man admitting in public that the structure he built to protect his family has become the thing endangering it. Gustav did not look at her while he spoke. He looked at his wife's face tilted against his chest, her eyes half closed, her breath leaving her mouth in wisps that vanished instantly in the frozen air. She needs real warmth, not warmth that leaks through cracks, not warmth that runs up a chimney, warmth that stays. If I can't find it, I'll lose her before nightfall. Josiah Whitfield had built a career on words, 30 years of sermons, eulogies, benedictions, prayers, thousands of hours of language shaped and deployed with the confidence of a man who believed he spoke on behalf of the Almighty. Every Sunday he stood before his congregation and interpreted the will of God with the certainty of someone reading a map. Now he stood in snow to his knees holding a daughter whose feet were the color of rotten fruit, and the entire vocabulary of faith and authority that had sustained him for 3 decades compressed itself into a single syllable that contained more theology than any sermon he had ever preached. Please. Bridget looked at them for a long time. Not with triumph and not with revenge and not with the satisfaction of the vindicated, though she had earned all three and anyone watching would have forgiven her for taking them. She looked at Harold and saw Martha's story of father who had buried a son in frozen ground and spent every year since trying to build a house strong enough to keep death outside. She looked at Gustav and saw a man whose hands were shaking not from cold, but from the effort of holding the one person who made his 30 years of rebuilding mean something. She looked at Agnes and remembered a small knitted garment left at her door in darkness. The anonymous confession of a woman whose grief had calcified into judgment because judgment was the only shape grief could take and still allow her to function. They were not enemies. They were people who had been wrong in the specific way that frightened people are wrong, loudly, confidently, and with absolute conviction that cruelty was kindness, because it would prevent a tragedy they had already lived through once. Bridget opened the door of her dugout. Come in, there's room for everyone. Harold was the last one through the door. His sons had gone first, then Martha, then the Lindgrens and Whitfields crowding in with the desperate haste of people abandoning a sinking ship. Harold paused at the threshold. His hand rested on the doorframe, rough wood cold under his fingers, and for a long moment he could not make himself step down. Crossing that threshold meant something beyond entering a room. It meant conceding that the two-story house behind him, the house he had built board by board as a fortress against the memory of his dead son, had been the wrong answer from the beginning. His body decided before his pride did. His knees buckled slightly with the temperature change the way a man buckles when he steps into a warm bath after days in the cold, and the involuntary surrender of his muscles carried him forward and down the step before his mind could object. Inside, the reactions were as varied as the people producing them. The Mercer boys simply stopped froze mid-step with their mouths open, their swollen ears beginning to prickle and burn as blood forced its way back into tissue that had been clenched against it for 3 days. Gustav knelt on the stone floor and laid his wife down with the tenderness of a man placing an offering on an altar. And her breathing began to slow almost immediately, the rapid shallow panic giving way to something deeper as her lungs encountered air that carried no ice crystals, no smoke, no invisible blades of cold. Clara Whitfield, who had been rigid with pain in her father's arms, went limp, not unconscious but released the tension of sustained suffering, finally finding a temperature in which it could let go. Agnes watched her daughter's body relax and pressed both hands over her own mouth to keep the sound inside a sound that was not a cry but the inverse of one. The silence of a catastrophe that has just barely failed to happen. 14 people in a space built for one. Bridget organized them with the quiet authority of someone who understood that efficiency was compassion and that sentimentality was a luxury available only to people who were not responsible for keeping 14 bodies alive in 27 square meters. Children and the sick near the stove. Men along the outer walls where the temperature was lower, but still 20 degrees above survival. Women in the middle creating a human layer that shared and circulated body heat. She heated stones on the stove and wrapped them in rags and placed them against the bodies of those who were coldest. She brewed tea from the last of her chamomile, the same chamomile Agnes had left at her door, and distributed it in the only vessel she had, her single tin cup, passed from hand to hand, mouth to mouth. The intimacy of shared drinking, erasing the social distances that had seemed so important a week ago. She fed the stove twice a day, 2 handfuls of buffalo chips at dawn, 2 at dusk. The stones beneath did the rest, absorbing and releasing, with the patience of geological time, maintaining a temperature that never dropped below 54 degrees and never rose above 61. The constancy of it was almost unsettling to people who had spent the last 3 days riding the violent oscillations of wooden house heating, blazing hot near the fire, freezing cold away from it, the temperature swinging 20 degrees every time someone opened a door or the wind shifted direction. Here there were no swings. Here there was only steadiness, the kind of steadiness that the earth had been practicing for 4 billion years. They ate little. Bridget's provisions divided among 14 mouths produced portions that would have seemed insulting. In ordinary times, a cup of bean broth, a quarter of a potato, a strip of rabbit jerky the width of a finger. But hunger was a negotiable discomfort, and cold was a non-negotiable death sentence. And every person in the dugout understood the exchange without being told. The mild ache of an empty stomach was the price of admission to a space where their children's ears were not turning black, and their wives were not coughing blood, and their feet were not swelling with the rot that comes when flesh freezes and thaws and freezes again. Mrs. Lindgren improved. The air in the dugout, free of drafts, free of smoke, free of the microscopic ice particles that had been lacerating her airways for weeks, let her lungs rest for the first time since autumn. The cough softened from a wet tearing sound to a dry occasional bark, and by the second day she was sitting up and drinking broth under her own power. Gustav watched this recovery with the expression of a man watching a mathematical proof that contradicts everything he learned in school. Unable to deny it, unable to explain it, unable to reconcile it with 30 years of professional knowledge that had told him the answer was wood and nails and glass. Clara Whitfield's feet, kept consistently warm for the first time since the frostbite began, started to respond. The purple faded to red, and the red faded to pink, and the swelling receded by fractions of inches that Agnes measured with her eyes every hour, tracking the retreat of damage, the way a farmer tracks the retreat of floodwater. The girl slept deeply, and without pain, her body finally able to direct its energy toward healing rather than merely surviving. The first night passed in uncomfortable silence, the silence of people who have too much to say and no language adequate to say it. The second night, the silence began to crack. Martha Mercer sat near the entrance with sensation returning to her fingers in waves of pins and needles, and her voice came out before she could shape it into something appropriate, raw, and stripped of the careful phrasing she usually employed around her husband's reputation. "We called you crazy. We said you would die. God forgive us for every word." Bridget was adjusting the stove damper, her back to the room. "It doesn't matter now, Mrs. Mercer. It does matter." And it was true. Every word of it was true, and we said it, and we were wrong, and you were right, and we are alive right now, because of the thing we said would kill you. Martha's voice broke on the last phrase, and the breaking was not weakness, but the sound of honesty forcing its way through decades of social performance. Gustav sat against the far wall with his wife's head in his lap, his rough hands stroking her hair, with a gentleness that seemed impossible from fingers that thick. He stared at the smooth earthen walls as if reading a language he had spent his life refusing to learn. "This shouldn't work. 30 years I've built houses, measured lumber, calculated load-bearing walls, fitted joints so tight you couldn't slip a playing card between them. And this," he gestured at the room, with one hand the movement encompassing everything the earth, the stones, the crude barrel stove, the living grass growing on the roof above their heads. "This works better than all of it. Everything I built fights the cold. This place just exists alongside it, and in that existence, there's something I don't have a name for." "Peace," Bridget said without turning around. "The word is peace." Hours later, when most of the group had fallen into the fitful half-sleep of the exhausted Gustav, found Bridget still awake, feeding the pre-dawn fire. He spoke barely above a breath, as if confessing to a priest. "I went broke in Minnesota. Lost the shop, the house, everything. Creditors took it all. My wife almost left. We came out here with nothing, and I rebuilt from my hands, just my hands and what they knew how to do. Carpentry was the only thing nobody could repossess, so I held on to it like a religion. Every joint I cut, every wall I raised, it was proof that I'd come back from the bottom, that I wasn't the failure they said I was." He paused. The fire crackled softly. "When you turned down my wood last summer, it wasn't just lumber you were refusing. It was everything I'd built myself into. And I hated you for it. Not because you were wrong, but because I knew somewhere I wouldn't look that you were right. That the thing I'd staked my whole second life on was incomplete. That a girl half my age with a shovel understood something I'd missed in 3 decades of practice. He stopped again, and when he resumed, his voice was hoarse with something heavier than smoke. You had every right to leave us outside. Why didn't you? Bridget placed the second handful of fuel into the stove and closed the iron door. Because if I did, I'd become the thing they said I was, someone who lives in a hole and knows nothing about people. Gustav said nothing more, but in the dim light of the stove's glow, his eyes were wet. On the second midnight, with the blizzard screaming its renewal outside and the dugout holding its warmth like a cupped palm around a candle flame, Agnes Whitfield sat beside her sleeping daughter and came apart. It began as a tremor in her hands and traveled upward through her arms and into her chest, and from her chest into her throat, where it became a sound she had not made in 7 years. The raw, ugly animal sound of a woman who has lost a child and has been holding the scream inside her body like a swallowed stone ever since. I had a daughter named Grace, she whispered, and the whisper was louder than the storm. She was 3. She died on the prairie from a fever. No doctor within 40 miles. I held her for the last night and sang to her until her body cooled in my arms, and I couldn't tell any more where she ended and the cold began. Bridget was the only other person awake. She did not move. She did not comfort. She sat still and listened with the attentiveness of someone who understands that some pain cannot be softened, only witnessed. When I saw you young and alone carrying a child into conditions that kill grown men, I didn't see sin. I saw Grace dying again. I thought if I could take your baby away from you, give it to people with solid walls and steady income, then at least this time the child would survive. I wasn't punishing you. Agnes's voice fractured. I was trying to save Grace. 7 years too late and through the wrong girl, but I was trying to save her. The dugout was silent, except for the breathing of 12 sleeping people and the faint hiss of the stove. The package you left at my door last month, the knitted bonnet, that was Grace's pattern, wasn't it? Agnes did not answer with words. She nodded, and the nod broke the last wall, and she cried in a way that was not the crying of a strong person breaking, but the crying of a person who has finally been given permission to stop being strong. The specific devastating relief of letting go of a weight, carried so long it had become indistinguishable from the body carrying it. 7 years she had held it. 7 years of rigid morality and harsh judgment, and the desperate fiction that if people behaved correctly, then children would not die. And now the fiction was over, and the grief was here, and it was enormous and shapeless, and it did not care about propriety. Bridget moved to sit beside her. She did not say, "It will be all right," because it would not be all right. Grace was dead and would remain dead, and no amount of warmth or shelter could change that. She simply sat close enough that their shoulders touched, and she stayed there until Agnes's breathing slowed, and the contact of one body against another said what words could not. 7 years, and I haven't been able to cry until now. Agnes wiped her face with the heels of her hands. What kind of person can't mourn her own child? The kind who's afraid that if she starts, she won't stop. Agnes looked at her, really looked the way Martha had looked weeks ago, and saw not a disgraced girl but a 16-year-old who understood loss better than any adult in Broken Creek, because loss was the water she had been swimming in since the day her father chose silence over his own daughter. On the third morning, Harold Mercer sat alone in the far corner of the dugout, as far from the center as the walls would permit, still unconsciously maintaining the distance between himself and the admission that occupied the center of the room. Bridget brought him tea in the communal cup, and he wrapped both hands around it and held it against his sternum, as though trying to warm something deeper than his chest. Martha told me about William. Harold's entire body went rigid. The cup trembled between his palms. She shouldn't have. You built that house for him. The big house. 2 stories, 3 fireplaces, glass from back east. You built it so that what happened to William could never happen to another child under your roof. Harold did not look at her. He looked at the earthen wall in front of him, and his jaw worked silently for a long time, as if chewing on words too large to swallow. I built it 2 stories high, finest lumber in the territory, glass windows that cost more than most families earn in a month. I thought if it was big enough, strong enough, expensive enough. His voice dropped to a frequency barely distinguishable from silence, then the cold couldn't get in. Then no son of mine would ever stop breathing in the night, because his father's house wasn't good enough. The pause that followed was long enough to hold a sermon in. And now I'm sitting in a dugout that a 16-year-old girl built with a borrowed shovel, and my house is a block of ice 3 miles south, and my cattle are dead, and the glass I shipped from Pennsylvania has frost on the inside. And every dollar I spent, every nail I drove, Harold's voice did something unexpected. It bent upward into a sound that was not a laugh, but was shaped like one dry and cracked and carrying no humor at all. Only the specific exhaustion of a man who has reached the bottom of his own delusions and found them empty. William must be laughing at me from heaven right now. Or maybe he's just glad his father finally found a warm place to sit. Harold looked at Bridget for the first time since entering the dugout. Not at her belly, not at her youth, not at her poverty, but at her face. And what he found there was neither judgment nor pity, but something he had not received from another human being in 6 years. Understanding. The understanding of someone who knew what it meant to build something out of grief and have it be the wrong shape but the right intention. He nodded. Once. A single downward motion of his chin that contained more apology than 1,000 words could have carried. For Harold Mercer, that nod was the most expensive thing he had ever produced, more costly than the house, more costly than the glass, more costly than the 4 cords of oak that now lay as ash in 3 fireplaces that had failed to save anyone. It cost him his image of himself, and he paid it without negotiation, and Bridget accepted it without comment. And between the nod and the acceptance passed something that resembled forgiveness, but was actually something older and more durable. The mutual recognition of 2 people who had both tried to build shelter against a world that wanted to destroy them, and who had learned in different ways and at different costs that the earth does not negotiate with pride. That night, Elias found Bridget at the stove during her midnight feeding. His voice was pitched for her ears only. Why did you let them in? After everything they did to you, after every name and every prediction and every look, why did you open the door? Bridget arranged the fuel with precise, unhurried movements. My grandmother taught me that the earth takes in everyone who comes to it without asking whether they deserve shelter. It only asks one question, are you willing to come inside? I learned it from the earth, Elias. And the earth has never been wrong about who deserves warmth. The blizzard died on the 4th morning as abruptly as it had been born. The wind dropping from a roar to a moan to nothing in the space of an hour, the clouds pulling apart like torn cotton to reveal a sky of such violent blue that it hurt to look at. The sun rose over a transformed world. Everything was white. Every landmark was gone. The prairie had been remade in the image of blankness, and the only features that remained were the dark shapes of buildings in the valley below. Buildings that looked from the hilltop like toys left out by a careless child. 14 people climbed the step and emerged from the dugout into the light, blinking and shielding their eyes, their legs unsteady from 3 days of sitting and lying on stone. They stood in snow to their knees and looked down at what winter had done to their lives. The Mercer house still stood, but its windows were opaque with interior frost, each pane a milky blind eye. The new cattle barn, $300 of fresh lumber and careful engineering, had collapsed under the snow's weight, and the dark forms scattered across the white ground around it were cattle that would never stand again. Harold stared at the wreckage of his investment, and his face showed nothing, because there was nothing left to show. The Lindgren house had survived structurally, but icicles hung from the eaves like the teeth of an animal that had tried to swallow it. And the window of the new room, the Pittsburgh glass that Gustav had installed with such pride, was shattered. The frame buckled inward by the pressure of ice expanding in the gap between the panes. Gustav looked at it and saw not a broken window, but the end of a philosophy. 30 years of building beautiful things that fought every season, 5 weeks, a girl, a shovel, and something that embraced the weather instead. The Whitfield parsonage had lost a section of roof where snow had accumulated unevenly, and the exposed interior was visible from the hill chairs. Overturned a table draped in white, the beautiful cast-iron stove standing in a room open to the sky like a monument in a ruin. The dugout behind them was invisible. The door and the chimney pipe were the only evidence that a human being had ever touched this hill. The snow on the roof had merged seamlessly with the landscape. No damage, no collapse, no failure. The earth had borne what the wood could not. The three families dispersed without ceremony. Harold took Bridget's hand and held it with both of his for a long moment, and in the grip was every word he would never say. Not because he lacked the language, but because some debts are too large for language and can only be acknowledged through pressure and duration. And the willingness to stand in front of someone you wronged and let them feel the weight of your regret through your skin. Gustav kissed her forehead, a gesture he had reserved for his own children, and the kiss was a promotion, an adoption, a reclassification of a stranger into kin. Agnes stood before Bridget and opened her mouth and closed it and opened it again, her lifelong facility with words abandoning her at the moment she needed them most. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around the girl she had tried to separate from her unborn child. And the embrace lasted long enough for both of them to feel the other's heartbeat, and it was Agnes who let go last. The winter continued, but its worst was spent. There were more cold nights and more gray days and more wind that made the prairie moan. But the killing fury of those 3 days in December did not return. Gustav Lindgren appeared at the dugout 2 weeks later, hat in hand, standing in the snow like a penitent at a church door. Teach me. 2 words offered without qualification or condition. Bridget shared everything Grandma Lou had given her: thermal mass, natural insulation, earth-sheltered construction, the principle of working alongside the land instead of against it. Gustav took notes in a carpenter's journal with the handwriting of a man whose hand was steadier than his pride. He asked questions with the humility of someone who has discovered at 50 that his education was a prologue, not a conclusion. And when he returned to the valley, he carried with him not just techniques, but a fundamental reorientation of his understanding of what a house was supposed to do. He became the evangelist. He had the authority that Bridget could never possess: the authority of age, of gender, of professional reputation, of being Gustav Lindgren, rather than a 16-year-old girl that the town had tried to send to an orphanage. But he wielded that authority with a discipline she had not expected, crediting her in every conversation, naming her in every explanation. I learned this from Bridget Callahan, he told anyone who would listen. The girl we called crazy saved my wife's life and taught me more about building in one afternoon than I learned in 30 years with a hammer. By March, 3 more families in the county had begun excavating partially subterranean dwellings or incorporating thermal mass principles into their existing homes. The hill north of Broken Creek, once the punchline of a communal joke, was becoming a destination. Agnes Whitfield did not become a different person. She still wore black. She still kept order. She still maintained standards that she believed separated civilization from chaos. But in February, on a cold afternoon when the light through her kitchen window was the color of weak tea, she dismantled the small white bed in the back room. She carried the pieces to the woodshed and stacked them neatly against the wall. And then she stood in the empty space where the bed had been and breathed the air that was different now. Not empty, but cleared the way a room feels after a window has been opened for the first time in years. She had kept that bed for 7 years as a monument to her daughter and as a cage for her grief. And releasing it was not forgetting Grace, but acknowledging that love did not require a shrine to remain real. That night she began knitting a new garment, not from Grace's pattern, but from a new one, her own design, sized for a baby who had not yet been born. Daniel Callahan arrived on an afternoon in April, when the last hard frost of the season was still biting the air outside, but the dugout held its warmth as steadily as it had held it in December. Martha Mercer and Mrs. Lindgren served as midwives, and the birth was neither easy nor dramatic. It was the ordinary miracle of a body doing what bodies do, painful and bloody and loud, and ending in a small red-haired creature whose lungs announced his presence to the world with a fury that seemed disproportionate to his size. Bridget held him against her chest and felt the vibration of his screaming travel through her ribs and into her spine, and she named him Daniel. God is my judge, because human judgment had proven itself worthless, and only the earth and whatever moved within it had shown her mercy when mercy was not fashionable. Harold Mercer arrived 3 days later leading a milk cow on a rope. He tied the cow to a post near the dugout entrance and stood for a moment looking at the door behind which a baby was sleeping. And his face held the complex expression of a man who is simultaneously ashamed of his past and grateful for his present and uncertain how to carry both without dropping one. He did not say the word sorry, because the cow said it for him, and the cow would go on saying it twice a day for years in milk. Gustav Lindgren brought a cradle. He had carved it from black walnut over 2 weeks working at night by lamplight, and the woodwork was the finest he had ever produced, not because the joints were tighter or the finish smoother than his other work, though they were, but because the design on the headboard broke from every pattern he had ever used. No roses, no angels, no classical motifs shipped from a catalogue. The carvings showed prairie grass and the curved entrance of a dugout, and they said in the language of wood what Gustav could not say in the language of words, that beauty was not what he had always assumed it was, and that the most beautiful thing he had ever seen was a hole in a hill that kept people alive. Agnes came last. She carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth, and when Bridget unwrapped it, she found a baby blanket knitted in a pattern she had not seen before. Not Grace's cable stitch, but something new, looser, more open, as if the knitter had decided to let more air pass through, more light, more of whatever moves between the stitches of a life that has been held too tight for too long. Agnes held the blanket out, and the word came from a place deeper than her throat, deeper than her chest, from the bedrock, where the last of her resistance had finally been worn smooth. Forgive me. Already have, Mrs. Whitfield. Already have. Agnes looked at the blanket in Bridget's hands, and then at the baby sleeping in the black walnut cradle, and Bridget understood that the apology was not only for the harsh words at the general store, or the charity visit, or the threat of the orphanage. Agnes was apologizing to Grace to the memory of a daughter she had tried to protect by becoming hard, by building walls of morality around a wound that needed air, by judging every mother she met against the impossible standard of a mother who could have saved her child if only she had lived in a different house, a different winter, a different world. The blanket was the evidence that Agnes was done building that wall, not because the grief was over, grief like that is never over, but because she had learned in a dugout on a frozen hill that walls built to contain pain eventually become the pain themselves. The years softened. Bridget expanded her dugout, carving a second room at a right angle to the first, the new space serving as a bedroom, while the original became a kitchen and living area. She planted a garden on her roof, and the vegetables grew with remarkable vigor in the deep, warm soil that was heated from below by the living space beneath it. Tomatoes and squash and beans that outperformed every surface garden in the valley, because their roots were always warm, always watered by the condensation that rose from below, always protected from the wind that stunted everything else on the open prairie. She bought goats with money earned, selling dugout designs to settlers who arrived each spring looking for affordable shelter on unforgiving land. The goats lived in a wing she excavated specifically for them, cool in summer, warm in winter, producing milk year-round with a consistency that baffled the ranchers, who lost production every January when their cattle shivered in drafty barns. Bridget Callahan, the girl who had been told she would not survive October, was becoming prosperous in the quietest possible way, not through ambition, but through adequacy, not through dominance, but through cooperation with a landscape that rewarded those who listened. Elias Lindgren, 15, now came to help with heavy work digging, hauling, lifting the things that a woman of 17 with a baby on her hip could not manage alone. He arrived with excuses that grew thinner. Each visit a fence post that needed replacing, a goat that needed chewing, a wall that needed inspecting. And Bridget saw the way he looked at the dugout and the rooftop garden, and the quiet, orderly life she had built from nothing. And she recognized the expression, because she had seen it in her own face the first time Grandma Lou had described a house made of earth. It was the look of someone seeing not what is, but what could be the look of a young man standing at the border of a future that had a different shape than the one his father had drawn for him. One day he would ask if he could build a house beside hers, not on top of the earth, but woven into it. And she would say yes, and they would build something together that honored the old knowledge and embraced the new possibilities. But that was future, and the future was patient, and it could wait the way the earth waits, without anxiety, without hurry, with the absolute confidence of something that has been here longer than memory, and will be here after memory is gone. On an evening in June, with the light turning the prairie the color of warm honey, and the air carrying the scent of sage and sun-baked soil, Bridget sat at the entrance of her dugout with Daniel asleep in her lap. His breathing was slow and soft against her chest, and his small fist curled around her index finger with the grip strength of someone who has already decided not to let go of the world. Below in the valley, the wooden houses of Broken Creek stood as they always had, vertical, proud, fighting the sky. But on the hills around them, scattered across the rolling landscape like green scars healing over old wounds, more earthen mounds were appearing. New families, new settlers, people learning the lesson that Broken Creek had paid for in frostbitten toes and collapsed barns and 3 days of humility, in a space no bigger than a generous closet. A meadow lark sang from a fence post, the same song it had sung in October, the same song it would sing in October again, the cyclical anthem of a creature that does not need to understand the earth to trust it. Bridget Callahan lived to 74 years old in the dugout she had excavated with her own hands at 16. She saw her grandchildren and great-grandchildren play in the garden that grew on her roof. She watched Broken Creek transform from a settlement that fought the land into a community that understood it. And when she died on an autumn afternoon as golden as the one when she had finished building her home, the last thing she saw was the earthen ceiling above her bed, the same ceiling that had sheltered her through 58 winters, without once asking her to be anything other than what she was. The earth had said, "Come in, let me hold you." And she had come in, and it had been enough.